Alright, let's dive into this in a way that's raw, unapologetic, and straight from the gut. Because the story you're about to hear is not the glossy, media-polished version. It's the unfiltered truth behind why the U.S. is leaning on India so hard, why a 25% tariff threat suddenly became a headline, and why, beneath all the noise, this is about much more than economics. It's about power, pride, and positioning in a world that's shifting faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. You see, when a superpower feels its grip on the steering wheel of the world loosening, it doesn't politely ask for the wheel back. It tightens its grip, sometimes to the point of bruising the other hand that's holding it. That's what's happening here. For decades, the U.S. has operated with the assumption that it sets the rules. Trade agreements, they dictate them. Tariffs, they decide who pays and who doesn't. Markets, they open them for friends and close them for enemies. And here's the uncomfortable truth. India has stopped playing the role of the obedient junior partner. India's economy is no longer small enough to be pushed around with a few friendly trade talks. It's a behemoth in the making, a market too large to ignore, and a player that's increasingly confident in saying no. And that confidence, it terrifies people who have built their empires on the idea that others will always say yes. The 25% tariff threat, that's not just about balancing trade numbers. That's Washington's way of sending a message. Remember who's boss. But here's the twist. India isn't blinking. The trade war narrative is just the cover. If you peel back the layers, this is about control over the future. The U.S. knows that the 21st century is going to be defined by whoever controls three things: technology, energy, and supply chains. And India, with its booming tech sector, its strategic alliances, and its growing manufacturing base, is inching into territory America has long dominated. If the U.S. can't outcompete India quietly, it will try to slow it down publicly. And tariffs, as blunt as they are one of the oldest tools in that playbook. But here's where America miscalculated. India has learned from decades of being on the receiving end of other people's rules. It has developed something the West never really accounted for: economic resilience mixed with political will. When you combine a billion-strong consumer market with a leadership that's not afraid to push back, you create a nation that can absorb short-term pain for long-term gain. Tariffs hurt, sure, in the short run, but they also push India to build domestic capacity, find alternative partners, and strengthen its own internal markets. And once that happens, no amount of external pressure will work the same way again. Let's not pretend this is happening in a vacuum. America is juggling challenges from all sides. China is already the main strategic rival. Europe is becoming less predictable. Africa is aligning with new partners. And Latin America is no longer the backyard it used to be. In that chaos, India is the one country with the population, the economic growth rate, and the geopolitical position to rise without being dependent on Washington's approval. That's why this pressure feels so intense. It's not about what India is doing wrong. It's about what India is doing right now. Let's talk numbers, because they cut through emotion. Trade between the U.S. and India isn't one-sided. America sells billions in goods and services to India: aircraft, defense equipment, tech solutions, and India sells billions back: pharmaceuticals, textiles, IT services, and increasingly high-value manufactured goods. A 25% tariff isn't just a punishment to India. It's a disruption to American companies that rely on Indian products. It's a double-edged sword, but Washington is betting that the shock will make India negotiate from a weaker position. The thing is, they're betting against a country that's built for endurance. See, India has been through far worse than tariff threats: colonial exploitation, economic crises, sanctions, and yet it has always found a way to turn constraints into catalysts. The more you limit India's access to something, the more it finds ways to build it at home or find it elsewhere. Tariffs might slow a few sectors, but they won't stop the trajectory. If anything, they'll accelerate the push towards self-reliance, and that's the exact opposite of what the U.S. actually wants. Here's another layer. Most people aren't talking about the currency game. America's economic dominance isn't just about GDP. It's about the dollar being the world's reserve currency. Every global trade deal that's done in dollars strengthens U.S. influence. India, along with several other rising economies, has been exploring ways to settle trade in local currencies or alternative systems. That's a direct challenge to the financial architecture America depends on. And if tariffs can scare India into slowing that process, it buys Washington more time to adapt. This isn't paranoia, this is strategy, and then there's defense. The U.S. and India have been growing closer in military cooperation, joint exercises, and defense deals. But that relationship has a ceiling. America prefers partners who are strategically aligned but economically dependent. India isn't playing that game. It's buying from multiple suppliers, investing in indigenous weapon systems, and refusing to be locked into a one-sided dependency. That independence is admirable from a sovereignty perspective, but from a superpower's perspective, it's dangerous. And dangerous things are managed, not encouraged. The media will tell you that this is just Trump's negotiation style. Throw out a big threat, then backtrack once you get concessions. But let's not kid ourselves. This runs deeper than one administration or one president. U.S. foreign policy has a long memory and a clear hierarchy of interests. India's rise has been tolerated as long as it served U.S. goals in counterbalancing China. But the moment that rise starts to carve out space for a truly independent pole of power, the gloves come off. Tariffs, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure become tools of choice now. Here's the part most people overlook. The American public isn't really invested in this. They're told it's about protecting American jobs or balancing trade. But the reality is, most tariffs don't protect jobs in the way they're sold. They shift them, sometimes at a cost to the very industries they claim to help. This is less about protecting the U.S. worker and more about protecting U.S. leverage. It's about making sure India doesn't set too many rules in global trade forums, doesn't control too many critical supply chains, and doesn't become a partner for countries looking to bypass Washington altogether. But here's the irony: pressure can backfire. Push too hard and you accelerate the very change you're trying to stop. India is already pivoting toward deeper ties with Southeast Asia, Africa, and even Latin America. It's strengthening economic partnerships with Russia, the Middle East, and Europe. Every new tariff or restriction from the U.S. makes those alternative routes more attractive, and once those networks are in place, they're hard to dismantle. What we're witnessing is not just a trade dispute. It's the early stages of a realignment in global power. The U.S. is used to being the sun around which everyone else orbits. India is building its own gravitational pull. The tariff threat is just one small flare-up in a much bigger shift, one where alliances are fluid, power is distributed, and no single country can dictate terms unilaterally anymore. This is the multipolar world people have been talking about for years, and it's arriving faster than anyone expected. So, why is the U.S. pressuring India? Because it sees the writing on the wall. Because it knows that a strong, independent India isn't just a valuable partner, it's also a potential competitor for influence, markets, and leadership in shaping the rules of the game. And in the high-stakes world of geopolitics, nobody gives up influence without a fight. The 25% tariff threat isn't the end of this story. It's just the opening move in a much longer, much more complicated game, and in this game, the real question isn't whether India will fold under pressure. The real question is how much stronger it will be when the dust settles, because history has a funny way of rewarding nations that refuse to be bullied, that take short-term pain for long-term sovereignty. And if there's one thing you can bet on, it's that India has the patience, the population, and the persistence to play the long game better than most. This isn't the end of the conversation between Washington and New Delhi. It's a negotiation, a test of wills, and a preview of the kind of world we're heading into, one where no single capital can dictate terms to the rest. And in that world, those who know how to stand their ground will be the ones writing the next chapter of history, not just reading it. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation. India's ability to absorb short-term economic pain is underestimated by U.S. policymakers because for decades, Western strategists have looked at the Indian economy and society through a lens shaped by their own history and their own fragility thresholds. They assume that every economy reacts to pressure in the same way theirs does, that an immediate shock to trade, currency, or manufacturing will trigger political chaos, public unrest, and a swift retreat from any bold policy decisions. But India is not a country that measures its strength in quarterly earnings or political approval ratings. It's a civilization, state with thousands of years of endurance built into its cultural DNA. A nation that has endured and recovered from every imaginable hardship: colonization, famine, partition, wars, sanctions, and economic isolation, without surrendering its core ambitions. That ability to take a punch, stay on its feet, and even come back swinging is precisely what the U.S. has failed to account for in its tariff threats and trade pressures. The birth of India's assertive military doctrine in this environment isn't a coincidence. It's directly tied to this underestimated resilience. When external pressure mounts, India doesn't just react defensively. It recalibrates its entire long-term strategy, making sure that the next time a similar challenge comes, it is better prepared and less dependent on any single partner. That's exactly what's happening now. The military establishment has taken the economic friction with the U.S. as a signal to accelerate self-reliance in defense production, to reduce vulnerabilities in weapons imports, and to leverage innovation as a multiplier of power. This isn't about chest-thumping nationalism. It's a cold, calculated recognition that economic sovereignty and military strength are inseparable in the modern world. For decades, India's military procurement had been heavily dependent on external suppliers: Russia for legacy platforms, the U.S. for advanced systems, France for cutting-edge aerospace, Israel for niche technologies. This diversification itself was a defense against over-reliance, but it still left India exposed to geopolitical leverage. Tariffs, sanctions, and export restrictions from any of these partners could slow down modernization plans. The new doctrine flips that vulnerability on its head by tying military readiness to domestic manufacturing capacity, indigenous R/D, and dual-use technology ecosystems that can draw from both civilian innovation and defense-specific programs. The moment policymakers realized that the same U.S. that calls India a strategic partner could still weaponize trade policy against it, the push for true independence in defense tech moved from aspiration to necessity, and here's where India's tolerance for short-term pain becomes a weapon of its own. U.S. policymakers tend to believe that if you squeeze a country's economy hard enough, the leadership will inevitably cave in to avoid political fallout. In India's case, that's a misread of both the political culture and the public's long-term mindset. Indian society has a high tolerance for economic discomfort when it's framed as part of a larger national struggle. People who have lived through currency demonetization, fuel price spikes, and decades of development challenges are not going to demand an immediate reversal of policy just because imports get more expensive for a few years. If anything, a visible external challenge can rally public support for government decisions that emphasize self-reliance, sovereignty, and dignity on the world stage. This is exactly the opposite of the environment U.S. negotiators are used to. In the West, particularly in the U.S., economic pain translates quickly into political cost. Politicians there operate in a climate where consumer expectations are high, tolerance for inflation is low, and news cycles punish any hint of instability. In India, there's an embedded understanding that progress is a long game, that discomfort today can mean strength tomorrow. That's why tariffs, while inconvenient, can actually fuel strategic unity rather than fracture it. And this unity becomes a force multiplier for the military doctrine, because it means the political leadership has the domestic breathing room to invest heavily in innovation and infrastructure that may not yield immediate returns, but will pay off massively over the next decade. The assertive military doctrine that emerges from this climate isn't just about buying more weapons. It's about reimagining the architecture of India's defense posture. It means developing systems that are cost-effective, adaptable to different battle scenarios, and produced in facilities that can't be shut down by foreign political decisions. It means turning startups into defense contractors, universities into research hubs for next-gen weaponry, and civilian tech giants into suppliers of military-grade software and AI systems. This blending of civilian and defense innovation is something the U.S. itself perfected in the 20th century, but it never anticipated India scaling it in the 21st, especially under external pressure instead of under a cooperative framework. Another underestimated factor is India's demographic advantage. With a young, tech-savvy population and a growing industrial base, the country can mobilize both brainpower and manufacturing capacity faster than many developed economies weighed down by aging workforces. Tariffs and trade restrictions, instead of slowing this process, can act as a forcing function, pushing more investment into domestic capacity, accelerating training programs for specialized manufacturing, and incentivizing public-private partnerships in high-tech defense sectors. Every month of economic pressure becomes another month where foreign dependency weakens and local capability strengthens. U.S. policymakers often think in election cycles. India, in this doctrine, is thinking in generational shifts. History also plays a critical role in shaping this mindset. This is not the first time India has faced technology denial regimes. After the nuclear tests of 1974 and again in 1998, sanctions and embargoes were imposed to choke India's strategic capabilities. Instead of folding, India responded by building its own nuclear fuel cycle, its own missile programs, and indigenous satellite launch capabilities. What the U.S. saw as punishment became the crucible in which India forged the very technologies that now give it strategic autonomy. The tariff threats of today are, in that sense, simply another chapter in a long, running story of external pressure leading to internal strengthening. This is where the underestimation becomes most costly for U.S. strategy. By assuming India will bend quickly to avoid economic discomfort, policymakers risk pushing it into a mode where innovation is accelerated precisely because of the discomfort. Tariffs make imported components more expensive. then design new components at home, export restrictions on critical software or hardware, develop domestic alternatives, loss of a market for a particular export, find or create another market in Southeast Asia, Africa, or Latin America. In this way, every short-term barrier becomes a stepping stone toward greater independence. And in military terms, independence means fewer points of vulnerability for adversaries to exploit. There's also a psychological dimension to this underestimated resilience. In strategic culture, there's a concept called strategic patience, the willingness to wait out an opponent's moves without being baited into reactive mistakes. India's leadership understands that the U.S., despite its power, is under internal pressures, political polarization, economic inequality, shifting public opinion on foreign policy. If India can simply hold its position, absorbing the short-term shocks, it can emerge from the standoff in a stronger relative position without having to make damaging concessions. This patience isn't passive. It's accompanied by active investment in alternatives so that when the standoff ends, India is less dependent than when it began in military terms. This doctrine manifests in the pursuit of force projection capabilities that don't rely on foreign approval. Indigenous aircraft carriers, homegrown fighter jets, domestically designed missile systems, AI-powered surveillance networks, these aren't vanity projects. They are the infrastructure of independence built under the understanding that any partner today could be a lever of pressure tomorrow. And every tariff, every diplomatic jab, every supply chain disruption only reinforces the urgency of completing these projects ahead of schedule. U.S. policymakers are often trained to read economic signals as indicators of political flexibility. In India's case, those signals can be deceptive. An uptick in inflation, a slowdown in imports, a shift in consumer spending in Washington's playbook. Those are signs to increase pressure. In India's reality, they can be signs of adaptation, of resources being reallocated to strengthen domestic resilience. This difference in interpretation means the U.S. could unintentionally be speeding up the very strategic shift it's trying to prevent. And when that shift solidifies, India's military doctrine will be even more assertive, its innovation pipeline even more robust, and its tolerance for pressure even higher. Ultimately, the ability to absorb short-term economic pain is not a weakness that needs to be endured. It's a strategic asset that can be deployed. India has turned it into a shield against external coercion and a lever for internal transformation. Every nation talks about being self-reliant, but very few are willing to pay the price to get there. India's willingness to pay that price politically, economically, and socially is what makes this moment pivotal. It's not just about surviving the tariff threats. It's about using them as the catalyst to lock in independence for decades to come. That's the part the U.S. has underestimated, and that underestimation could be the most consequential strategic miscalculation of this entire trade and defense equation.